It's the year 1868, and the Emperor of Japan was restored to power. And in later years, Japan would change a lot, with them having a new government and a new constitution. Japan would also start industrializing, and by 1871, they had a very strong army. And like all other countries with strong armies in the 19th century, Japan wanted to expand. And in December of the same year, a Ryukyuan ship was attacked on Taiwan and the crew was massacred. So, in 1874, using that incident as a pretext, Japan launched a military expansion to Taiwan to assert its claims to the Ryukyu Islands. That expedition featured the first instance of the Japanese military ignoring the orders of the civilian government, a theme that will be repeated a lot in later years. However, the success of this made Japan want more, and believe that it had to acquire its own colonies to compete with the Western colonial powers. And in 1894, Japanese and Chinese troops clashed in Korea, where they both stationed to suppress the Dongak Rebellion. And during the First Sino-Japanese War, Japan's highly motivated and well-led forces defeated the more numerous and better equipped military of the Qing dynasty. Thus, the island of Taiwan was ceded to Japan in 1895, and Japan's government gained enough international prestige to allow for Foreign Minister Mitsu Minimitsu to renegotiate the Unequals Treaty. And in 1902, Japan signed an important military alliance with Britain, so they can both counter Russia, who also wanted to expand in the region. For multiple reasons. First, since the early 17th century, Russia has established its authority all over Siberia, but its attempts to move southward were constantly blocked by China. And now, with a weaker China, Russia wanted to capitalize on that, so they can establish their influence in Manchuria and to reach warm waters throughout Korea. And here, the two powers would clash. As for the next 2 years, the two powers would compete over influence in China, as both countries sent troops to quell the Boxer Rebellion in 1897. The Russians took over the Port Arthur from China and started building a railway line throughout Manchuria, so they can connect the port to the Trans-Siberian Railway, and they also left over 150,000 troops there to protect the area. And by 1903, it increased that number even more, and of course, Japan didn't like that, as they felt threatened. However, Japan hoped they can solve this throughout negotiations, as they just wanted Russia to recognize their ownership over Korea. However, Russia refused, and instead wanted Japan to reduce its number of troops in Korea, and at that point, Russia still saw itself as the superior power, and that Japan wouldn't try to go to war. And on the 8th of February 1904, Japan declared war on Russia. However, 3 hours before that, Japan was already attacking the Russian East Fleet at Port Arthur, and Japan would be victorious, and that would allow them to send troops to Korea, and following that, a series of indecisive naval engagement followed, in which Admiral Togo was unable to attack the Russian fleet successfully, as it was protected by the shore batteries of Port Arthur. These engagements provided a cover for Japanese landing near Incheon, and from there, the Japanese occupied the rest of Korea. And by the end of April, the Japanese Imperial Army under Kuroki Tamimito was ready to cross the Yalu River into Russian-occupied Manchuria. Later, the Japanese Navy, seeking to gain control of the area, established a blockade of Port Arthur in the early stages of the war. The blockade aimed to prevent Russian ships from entering or leaving the port and to cut off supplies to the Russian forces stationed there, as the Japanese Navy used a combination of ships, mines, and coastal artillery to enforce the blockade. They also employed a strategy of isolation, cutting off communication and contact between the Russian forces in Port Arthur and the outside world. Meanwhile, the Russians were preparing to reinforce their Far East Fleet by sending the Baltic Fleet, under the command of Admiral Zinovy Rozhesvensky. And after a bad start caused by engine problems and other mishaps, the fleet finally departed on 15 October 1904. However, the Russian fleet fired on British fishing boats that they mistook for enemy torpedo boats, which nearly sparked a war with the United Kingdom. And because of that, the UK would block the Suez Canal, forcing the Russians to take an even longer route. Meanwhile, the war in China was getting worse with the fall of Port Arthur. And on the 20th of February 1905, the Battle of Mukden took place, which was the last major battle of the war. And after 3 weeks of fighting, the Russians decided to withdraw after suffering an estimated 19,000 casualties in the battle. The retreating Russian army disbanded as fighting units, but the Japanese failed to destroy them completely, since they also had suffered heavy casualties, and were in no condition to pursue. And although the Battle of Mukden was a major defeat for the Russians, and was the most decisive land battle ever fought by the Japanese, the final victory still depended on the navy. And in the Battle of Tsushima, May 27, 1905, the two fleets met in the Tsushima Strait between Korea and Japan, and the Japanese Navy under the commandment of Admiral Togo Heihachiro decisively defeated the Russian fleet. as the Japanese used their superior technology and tactics to sink 8 Russian battleships, while only losing 3 of their own. The battle marked the first time an Asian power had defeated a European power in a modern naval battle. And with that, Russia's hopes of winning the war ended, which led to the Treaty of Portsmouth, which ended the war. And under the treaty, Russia recognized Japan's ownership of Korea and agreed to evacuate Manchuria. Russia also signed over its 25-year-old holding rights to Port Arthur, including the naval base and the peninsula around it, and ceded the southern half of Sakhalin Island to Japan. And after the war, Japan emerged as a major world power, having demonstrated its military prowess and technology advancement on the world stage. The victory had also significant political and economic implications, as Japan's growing influence in Asia and the Pacific would shape the international relationships for decades to come. For Russia, the defeat was a devastating blow to its prestige and influence. The country faced widespread social and political unrest in the aftermath of the war, eventually leading to the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the fall of the Russian Empire. And from this video, we can all learn that Russia didn't learn that they can't win quick wars. Anyways, this is all for today. I am Wonder of You, and I'll see you again in the next video.